Officer Tiffany Rourke had spent a decade atonement for her mistakes. She had been a hothead, prone to losing control, but years of training had shaped her into a model officer, until that morning. It had all happened in a flash. Courtroom 2B of the Franklin County, Missouri, courthouse was quiet when she walked in. Her uniform was unwrinkled, her shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and the badge glittered across her chest as a reminder of her hard-won honor. But deep inside her there was a small spark, a remnant of her old self, and this morning, it was burning. She had been called to testify in a juvenile case, a nondescript drug possession case. But Tiffany never made it to the witness stand. Because as she walked in, she saw a well-dressed black man standing near the witness stand, talking quietly with one of the attorneys. No hesitation. No thought. She lunged across the courtroom and slapped him square in the face. The sound was as crisp as a whip. The room fell silent. Papers fell, a pen rolled across the floor. A frozen moment. The man did not flinch. He did not scream, did not retreat, did not even raise his hand to cover his cheek. He simply adjusted his tie, stroked his cheek with the back of his hand, and looked her straight in the eye. "I am Judge Antoine Kelly," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "And I preside over this trial today." A wave of tension swept through the room. It was no longer the silence of shock. It was heavy, compressed like an unexploded bomb. Tiffany's face was pale. She blinked repeatedly, her mouth opening as if to say something, but no words came out. The bailiff hesitantly approached the door, while the young defense attorney instinctively took out his phone and began recording. She wasn't the only one. Within seconds, at least 4 other phones were raised, pointed at Tiffany. She tried to speak, her voice hoarse. I thought you weren't allowed to." But it was too late. Judge Kelly didn't say another word. He turned to the stunned courtroom. "We're taking a 10-minute recess." Then he turned and walked straight into his private room, expressionless. The room was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking. No one knew whether to stand or stay seated, whether to leave or wait. Tiffany stood still. The hand she had just swung out trembled at her side, as if it too realized the terrible mistake it had made. The prosecutor leaned toward her, whispering without emphasis. "You just assaulted a judge." Tiffany didn't answer. She just stood there, staring into space, as if the world had just collapsed beneath her feet. The news spread like wildfire. Reporters rushed to the courthouse, expecting to hear about a major gang indictment, but were suddenly drawn into a completely different story. 2 local news outlets received tips from interns, who fled the courtroom in terror. By midday, the raw clip had flooded social media. There was no editing. No context. Just a straight, crisp, tense shot, a white police officer in uniform slapping a black judge in the face in open court. The headlines that appeared across the internet were, "Cop slap judge, didn't know he was a judge." At first, some thought it might be staged, but the video was too real. It was chaotic in every detail, like an unedited version of reality, no background music, no flashy camera angles. There was only raw tension, raw expressions, and shocked reactions from lawyers, activists, and even defendants. Some recognized Tiffany Rourke immediately. Others knew her by reputation. Judge Kelly, on the other hand, remained silent. He did not appear on television, did not issue statements, did not threaten legal action. He just sat in his office, quietly reviewing his schedule, as if nothing had happened. But everyone understood that something had changed, an irreversible change. Before the public could process the shock, however, another question arose: who is Officer Tiffany Rourke, really? Before the slap, the name Tiffany Rourke was little known outside Franklin County. But on the force, she was not only famous, but feared. She rose quickly, from the police academy to the patrol squad, then the narcotics squad, then the high crime task force. She received medals, appeared on department newscasts, spoke at 2 police conferences. But that was only one side of Tiffany Rourke. Outside the spotlight, another story was taking shape. A young black driver was ticketed for a broken taillight. He swore he had done nothing wrong. When Tiffany tried to explain, she doubled the fine for failure to comply. He filed a complaint, but it went nowhere. A Latina mother said Tiffany searched her car without cause in front of a grocery store. When her 10-year-old daughter asked why, Tiffany simply said, "People should know better." The mother cried as she filed a report, but her complaint quickly disappeared. Another time, a clip emerged of Tiffany yelling at two black teenagers outside a convenience store, accusing them of loitering for no reason. One of them managed to record the conversation. But a few days later, the video mysteriously disappeared. Now, there was no hiding. It was explosive. And the whole country was watching. The whispers in the locker room began as soon as the doors closed after the arrest. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed in the cramped space, but the silence that followed was heavier. Some officers exchanged glances, discreet nods, a few bent over to tie their shoes, as if they didn't want to get involved. But others, accustomed to living in vague fear of the invisible powers, knew the storm was brewing. Tiffany hadn't arrived yet. She was never in a hurry, not when she knew the system had protected her for too long to be broken by a single incident in court. But this time, it wasn't like before. The warning signs had been there for months, the whispers had become whispers, and now, they were turning into full sentences. "I told you. This was going to happen," someone muttered. "But they fought back, right? That's what I heard." "Fuck fighting back. How can you fight back when your hands are tied?" The laughter was bitter and tired. Chief Brandon might still call her a good cop in a tough world, but in the locker room, those who had feared her were now wondering if Tiffany still had that power. Sam Delaney remembered the first time he'd seen Tiffany clearly. That time, when she'd slammed a suspect's head into the window of her patrol car, her eyes saying, "Report it, and you'll be nothing by Monday." He'd been silent. They'd all been silent. Not because they agreed, but because they knew Tiffany wasn't an individual, she was a symbol of a system that had gone untouched for too long. Jordan McLean had tried to fight that system. He filed a protest, detailing how Tiffany had stopped a series of cars based on the color of the driver. 2 weeks later, he was reassigned to office duty. Tiffany got the credit. That was how things worked. But this time was different. When she slapped Judge Antoine Kelly, she was no longer the controller of the system, but its weakness. Those who protected her were now looking for ways to distance themselves. Those who had kept quiet were looking for reasons to speak up. In a corner of the room, a young officer whispered, "I heard Internal Affairs is reviewing some old cases. Maybe this time." Someone sneered, "This time what? She still has friends up there. But are her friends willing to die with her?" Another voice chimed in, full of meaning. At the same time, Tiffany entered, her eyes scanning the room. She still carried the air of invulnerability, but no one said hello like before. The whispers died down, but they didn't disappear. They just waited. Because everyone knew, this time, Tiffany's time was really running out. It was just a regular Tuesday. Not for the dozens of people in the courtroom that day. Not for the lawyers, who had seen countless tense trials, but had never seen a uniformed police officer stand in front of a courtroom, walk up and slap a judge sitting on the bench. And certainly not for the man himself, Judge Kelly. He had been on the bench for 12 years, mostly in Franklin County. He was no flash, no celebrity, just a man of justice. A simple tie. An office with family photos, his wife and 3 sons, and a small gavel that his youngest son had made himself in the woodworking shop. He didn't have to say much, but everyone knew, his presence mattered. Born in St. Peters, Missouri, Kelly was the first in his family to go to college and then to pursue law. He had been a public defender for 7 years before switching sides, seeing cases ranging from petty to tragic, from meaningless to historic. He had handled them with the same calm and even-handedness. But that slap, it was more than just disrespect. It was a direct challenge, an undeniable public insult. And for a moment, the room fell silent. No one dared to speak before he did. But Kelly didn't speak right away. He didn't believe in drama. He believed in consequences. In the hallway, Monique Barnes, the court clerk, was frozen, still clutching the file she'd meant to hand him before it all happened. She stepped hesitantly into his office, cautious. "Are you okay?" she asked. Kelly looked up. Calm as ever. "I'm fine." "Sit down." She did, her eyes scanning his face, searching for any sign of anger. But there was none. Only determination. "I don't know what she thinks she's doing," Monique shook her head, her voice still laced with shock. "We could file a lawsuit. The footage is all over the place." Kelly nodded. "We could. But what?" she asked. "I want to see how they handle it." She tilted her head. "You mean, that part?" "The whole system," he said, folding his arms. "Let's see if it's still allergic to accountability." Monique blinked. She knew his style. Which meant he wouldn't push. He would wait. By lunchtime, Judge Kelly's name was trending. People remembered him from a speech he'd given at a local high school 2 years ago. The clips were reposted. His quotes include, "The law is not a weapon, it is a tool. And it belongs to everyone, not just those with the loudest voices." But he did not tweet. He did not issue a statement. And when asked by reporters later in the day if he planned to sue, he gave a single answer. "I expect the same level of professionalism and accountability from the system I have served for so many years. I've shown people for 12 years that I trust the system to handle this properly. That trust is a shield, a veneer of calm that hides the real challenge. And people have seen it. But inside the department, things are boiling, a storm brewing at the heart of the organization." The assistant chief left 3 messages on Tiffany's voicemail. The county's legal counsel sent a confidential inquiry to Human Resources. At least 2 junior officers called in sick. No one wanted to be caught up in this maelstrom. But Kelly said nothing, didn't need to. The videos spoke for themselves. No amount of excuses could erase those images. That night, at home, Nadine sat beside him on the couch, her hand clasped tightly around his. "You should have let them take her out in handcuffs." Her voice was soft as a breath, but filled with pent-up anger. Kelly was silent. He wanted to say that it wouldn't solve anything. But he knew, this time it was different. She sighed. "You think they'll get it right this time?" He looked down at their intertwined fingers. "I think this time, she picked the wrong person, in the wrong place, at the wrong time." But if Tiffany thought silence meant surrender, she was about to learn that sometimes, dignity was more powerful than any excuse. The next morning, Tiffany Rourke was placed on administrative leave. The official email didn't specify a reason, only that there was an ongoing investigation into an incident involving a court employee. But the truth didn't need a press release, it was everywhere. The slap went viral. News reports replayed it over and over, each frame interpreted from a dozen different angles. Podcasts analyzed her every word, every facial expression. Stories from people who had confronted Tiffany in the past popped up like mushrooms after a rainstorm. Then another video surfaced, from 4 years ago, a grainy image from a patrol car's camera. Tiffany stood there, yelling at a teenage boy as she held him back on the sidewalk. There was something different about her voice, a slight waver, an unmistakable threat. The boy was released without charge. But now, people weren't just talking. They were listening. And this time, her badge wasn't protecting her. There was a seismic shift in the department. Colleagues whispered in the hallways. People who had laughed with Tiffany at briefings now bustled as she passed. A memo from Internal Affairs was sent out, asking for interviews with anyone who had worked directly with Officer Rourke. More than a dozen cops responded within 24 hours. Not everyone left a name. But one decided not to keep quiet any longer. Detective Naomi Brennan had waited nearly 6 years to come forward. She threatened me in the locker room once. Naomi's voice was low but firm as she spoke to the investigators. She said if I continued to question her report, I would be transferred to the county jail. Naomi's words marked a turning point. It was no longer gossip. This was evidence. And this time, there was no turning back. Jacob Carter was a Star Academy cadet, now a seasoned patrol officer. He'd seen a lot on the force, but there was one he'd never forget, an incident with Tiffany Rourke. He'd stood by as Tiffany stuck a flashlight under a suspect's seat. It was a fleeting moment, but for someone like Jacob, it left a lasting impression. She called it insurance, saying no one would check her footage. Jacob hadn't said anything at the time. The door had opened, and soon it wasn't a big deal anymore. It was a spark, and from that spark, years of smoke had begun to build. Now, the fire had finally erupted. Internal Affairs began combing through Tiffany's old reports, comparing them, looking for patterns. The flimsy excuses, the disproportionate stops, the ignored complaints, all of it was suspiciously repetitive. Meanwhile, Tiffany scrambled to take control of the story. She appeared on a local conservative talk show, her voice shaking as she tried to explain herself. She accused Judge Kelly of intimidation and said it was all part of a campaign to get her down. But even her supporters began to distance themselves. When the host abruptly cut her off, saying they would wait for more information before drawing conclusions, Tiffany knew her defenses were cracking. Then came the email from her union attorney. Due to a conflict of interest, I can no longer represent you in this matter. The words were cold, but the message was clear, she was radioactive. Her inbox was flooded with messages from reporters. Friends stopped responding. Even her daughter, Avery, a 19-year-old freshman in college, left a terse message, "Why would you do that?" Tiffany sat quietly in her kitchen, looking at the medals she had worn as a waitress on display on the refrigerator. They looked different, heavier, as if they no longer belonged to her. She still believed she had done nothing wrong. He looks like a criminal, she muttered. He shouldn't be standing there, dressed like that, acting like he runs this place. But deep down, she knew it wasn't about what Judge Kelly wore or where he stood. It was about her instincts, the ones that had propelled her so far in her career, promoted, respected, feared, but never challenged. Now, those instincts had gone to pieces. 2 days after the incident, the Franklin County Sheriff's Department held its first press conference in 15 years. The sheriff, backed by legal counsel, said, "We do not condone Officer Rourke's actions. An internal investigation is underway. We take this very seriously. He didn't call her a good cop. He didn't say she'd served well." None of the words sounded protective. Just the cold, distant truth. Tiffany watched the press conference on TV, in her living room, like everyone else. If she thought the silence from her friends was the worst, she was about to find out something even more horrifying, when the entire structure she relied on began to crumble, brick by brick. Tiffany walked the streets that had once belonged to her, but no one looked at her the same way anymore. She no longer owned them. The furtive glances, quick, anxious, as if they were afraid of being caught near her, only confirmed it. Her control over the area was gone, leaving an eerie void, like a disfigured portrait removed but a rusted nail still standing on the wall. The administrative leave continued indefinitely. No pay. No badge. No answers. Just waiting within the 4 walls of her own home, where her world was shrinking by the day. She called her daughter, Avery, over and over again. No answer. She hadn't responded to any of her messages since that fateful night. They had never been close, Tiffany had raised her with rules, not tenderness. But this silence, this coldness, hit her in a way she didn't expect. She picked up the phone again, tried again. "Avery, this is Mom. Please, talk to Mom." The line went dead after the first ring. Tiffany stared at the blank screen for a long time before putting it down. For years, she had believed she was in control. She had thought that other people's fear meant respect, that complaints were just noise from people who didn't know the real business. But now, sitting at her kitchen table, the curtains drawn to keep out the cameras across the street, she was left with only time and silence. She hadn't been charged, not yet. But the police department was no longer protecting her. The union was silent. The attorney had stopped answering. And in that gap, accusations began to appear, spreading like an oil slick. A civil rights watchdog group requested a review of every case she had worked on in the past 5 years. Names were brought to light. Former suspects. Former officers. Even a retired judge, who vividly remembered Tiffany yelling at a defendant in court, something he had noted but had dismissed as just stress. She went online to read the comments, unable to resist the urge to see what people thought of her. "This is exactly why we need reform. This woman thinks she's above the law. She's messing with the wrong people, thank God for that. But the worst didn't come from enemies. I always felt like something was off about her. She was always too aggressive. I remember her laughing at a kid crying in an interrogation room. That stuck with me. It wasn't the betrayal that hurt, it was the erasure, as if she had never belonged to them." Her voicemail was full. Reporters. Civil lawyers. A documentary production company wanted her to tell her story. But she didn't call back. The only place she felt safe was in the garage, among the engines, the doors closed. There, she repeated familiar movements, as if she could find herself again amid the oil and metal. She replayed old cases, telling herself that if that judge hadn't tried to pick a fight, if he'd just taken a step back. But no matter how much she twisted the truth, she couldn't change one thing: her life, as she knew it, was over. Tiffany Rourke could not change what had happened. The slap echoed through the courtroom, far beyond the mahogany walls and the old benches. A slap aimed not at a dangerous suspect, not at a hardened criminal, but at a judge, a powerful man, sitting quietly in a high chair, someone who neither threatened her nor opposed her. And the whole country watched. The storm of public opinion rolled in like a tsunami. The sensational headlines, the social media clips, the sharp comments from former allies. But it wasn't the news that made her feel truly alone. It was the moment one quiet afternoon when Mrs. Beasley, the neighbor who waved to her every morning as she jogged, walked by with her small dog without so much as a glance in her direction. The quiet erasure. The wordless rejection. It was worse than the headlines, because the headlines would eventually fade, but the feeling of abandonment remained. It stuck with her into the night, when she absent-mindedly scrolled through old photos on her phone, her eyes landing on a picture in front of the police department sign. She was in uniform, sunglasses, hands on hips, once powerful and proud. Now, all she saw was arrogance. Then came the summons. A public hearing. A hearing not just to evaluate her behavior that day but to determine whether she was still fit to serve. It would take place Thursday morning, at 9:30, in the Franklin County City Council Hall, a place formal enough to indicate that this would not be a quiet review but a judgment that would be watched by the entire city. When Tiffany arrived, she was dressed in a simple black suit, no badge, no weapon, no symbols of the power she once held. The room was 3/4 full. Journalists lined the back wall, microphone cords strapped to their hips. The rows of chairs groaned under the weight of residents, activists, legal observers. In the second row, just behind the benches of the junior prosecutors, was Judge Antoine Kelly. Gone was the imposing black robe, just a smart gray suit, his gaze calm, a stack of notes neatly placed on his knees. He didn't look angry, nor did he look pleased. He looked like someone who had come to work, to witness, not to avenge. Tiffany's attorney was a newbie, a public defender, fresh-faced, his gaze uncertain. He stood close to her, whispering something, legal instructions that she didn't bother to listen to. Because this moment had no room for preparation. It was all about the truth. The Civilian Review Board sat on a raised dais, their faces solemn. A retired detective, a former public defender, a local pastor, a community organizer, a judge from another county. This wasn't a courtroom, but it might as well have been one in its own way. The presiding judge, Loretta Vaughn, didn't hesitate. She banged her gavel and began immediately, her voice as sharp as a scalpel. This hearing is not a trial. It is a public examination of Officer Tiffany Rourke's conduct, both recent and past. The door was still open. No one said it was a funeral for her career, but no one denied it. It was just that no one cared anymore. They started with footage from the courtroom, played on a small screen that couldn't quite convey the gravity of the moment. But it didn't matter. The sound echoed faintly in the hall. The slap. The silence. Judge Kelly's calm voice cut through the tension, followed by Officer Naomi Brennan's testimony. She read her prepared statement, each word like a knife. She recounted the threat Tiffany had made 6 years ago, her voice calm but unyielding. Then 2 ex-prisoners stepped forward. Both mentioned Tiffany's name, a name that appeared on their paperwork, a name that had the power to take their freedom without them being present. She had signed their arrest warrants without explanation. And now, in court, she sat motionless, staring straight ahead, refusing to respond. After a series of testimony, when it seemed like everything was about to end, Judge Kelly was called to the microphone. But he had no legal papers with him. No notes. He just stood there, buttoned his jacket, and said, "I'm not going to waste your time summarizing what we've seen. It's public record. What I want to talk about is what happened after that, after accountability was placed on the table. Because that's when the real work began." He paused. The only sound in the room was the scratching of pen on paper. "I've served this county for more than a decade. I've seen people do reckless things out of fear. I've seen people get angry when they feel backed into a corner. But what happened in my courtroom that day wasn't fear. It was a mistake. A reflex formed from years of having too much power and not enough control." He leaned forward, his eyes resting on Tiffany, just for a second. "I'm not here to ruin anyone's life. I'm here to remind this community what justice should look like. And it should never look like this again." When he sat down, there was no applause. No nods. Just silence. Tiffany's attorney made a final statement, mostly procedural, mostly a plea for mercy. But it didn't matter. The court had recessed, and when they returned, the decision had been made. Officer Tiffany Rourke will be permanently removed from office. All benefits revoked. And her case will be sent to the state attorney general for further review. She stood there, blank, as the room emptied. No one looked at her the same way. Not with fear. Not with hatred. Just with indifference. And that probably hurt more than anything. Judge Kelly passed her on his way out the door. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. Because some people don't need revenge. The truth has already taken care of itself. And long after the cameras stopped flashing, that door was still open. As the weeks passed, the headlines died down. Other scandals filled the pages, capturing public attention. But in Franklin County, this time something had really changed, not just in the whispers behind closed doors, but in the way people looked at the system, in the way they looked at each other. The courtroom was still busy, the cases continued as usual. But when Judge Antoine Kelly walked in, the room stood up in a different kind of respect. Not just because of his title, but because of the way he handled things. He never asked for attention, never asked for praise, just went about his business. One afternoon, after a juvenile hearing, a young defense attorney stopped him in the hallway. "Can I ask you something, Judge?" she said, glancing around. "That day, how did you keep your cool?" Kelly took a second, thinking. I don't want to give her what she wants. Then he smiled slightly, nodded, and walked away. The answer haunted her, echoing throughout the courthouse. In different ways, people began to change. Police officers began attending bias training not just to polish their records but to truly understand. A community board was given real power, more than a name tag and a folding table. Old case files were reviewed, not all of them, but enough to prove that the door had begun to open. And Tiffany Rourke? She faded from the life of the town. Her house was quietly sold, she moved 3 counties away without an interview, without a public statement. She took a job as a private security guard, and her name disappeared from the papers. There was no return, no redemption arc. She didn't lose everything, but she lost the only thing that mattered, control. And for the first time, she couldn't bend the silence to her will. Meanwhile, others were speaking up. Victims of other offices, in other times, now felt brave enough to speak out. They weren't asking for revenge, they just wanted to be heard. And that was the power of the moment when Tiffany's hand smashed into Judge Kelly's face. Not just an act of violence, but the public end of a private model, a system that had gone too long unchallenged. Franklin County, where things usually moved slowly and quietly, was shaken. 2 months later, at a town hall, a woman stood up. Her old glasses slid down her nose, her voice steady but sharp. I don't want another apology. I want policy. I want change without having to wait for the next viral video. The room nodded. They understood what she meant. Because this time, they saw what happens when someone believes their badge is a shield against consequences, and then the truth walks into the room, puts on a suit, and says, I am the judge today. This is not a Hollywood story. There is no dramatic final moment, no surprise confession. Just the slow but inexorable process of someone falling from the pedestal they built for themselves. And more importantly, the slower but more powerful process of others building something better in its place. The walls of that courtroom will never forget what happened inside them. The slap may fade, the cameras may turn, but the lesson remains: unchecked power is toxic. Silence can be louder than a scream. And true justice does not need to speak to be heard. So what do we learn from all this? Perhaps character is truly revealed when you think no one is watching. When you believe you are invulnerable. Or when the mask falls at the moment you can't get it back. Tiffany built an empire on fear. Judge Kelly built her presence on restraint. Only one person still has a seat in the room. And finally, what does justice look like?